So, in our third lesson of Latin, we will also have a look at the verbs. Again, as a quick reminder, each verb has 5 properties. We have person, here we have first, second, and third. And then we have number, singular and plural, no dual here. Next, we have the tenses. We have here 6 main tenses: present, imperfect, future, as well as perfect, plusquamperfect, and future perfect. Then we have the moods. Here we have indicative, subjunctive, and imperative, as well as non-finites such as infinitive and participles. And lastly, we have voice. Here we have active and passive, as well as deponent verbs. Those are morphologically passive forms but with an active meaning. And we have semi-deponent. Those are passive forms in the present system, active in the perfect system. Since I've already written a paper about Latin conjugation, I will just use part of this paper for today's lesson. So, in Latin, we have 4 different conjugations. These are named after the infinitive stems of the present active tense. So, we have R conjugation, stem ends in R. For example, laudare, lavare, amare. Then we have the E conjugation, similar reasoning. Delere, temere, terere. Then E conjugation, audire, venire, sentire. And then we have the consonantal conjugation, and here we have actually another subdivision. First, stem ending in a consonant. For example, correre, reggere, animadvertere. The other group also has a consonantal stem in the present indicative active, but the verbs in this group often add an E to the stem when conjugated in the present tense, and thus belong to the so-called mixed conjugations. This applies, for example, for the following verbs here. Of course, this also applies to compound verbs. Now, let's have briefly a closer look between the differences of the consonant and the mixed conjugation. As you can see in this table here, we have feature, consonant conjugation, and mixed conjugation. Let's start with the feature, stem vowel. For the consonant conjugation, we have a short E that changes or even disappears. Then, in the mixed conjugation, we have EO, which forms in the present stem. Then the infinitive. In the consonant conjugation, we have ere as the ending. So, we have also in a mixed conjugation. Then we have the first person singular. The consonant conjugation ends in O, that is a long O. But the mixed conjugation ends in EO. Again, a long O, but this time we have an E before the O. The same thing happens in the third person plural. Again, the consonant conjugation ends in und, while the mixed conjugation ends in junt, again with an E right before the und. So, to see it in practice, here with the consonant conjugation, rego, regis, regit. In mixed conjugation, capio, capis, capit. So, before we start with each conjugation, there are quite a few forms, but you will see that there are a lot of shortcuts. And this does not only work for Latin, but for verbs in general. So, let me show you how I, as a linguist, approach such obstacles. First note that each verb has 3 components that you need to take care of. That is not to be confused with the 5 properties of each verb that we have discussed at the very beginning of this lesson. So, the 3 components are: first, obviously, the verb stem. Each verb has its own verb stem. Yet, we have different verb stems for each verb as well, such as present and perfect. Next, for simplicity, I will refer to this component as indicator, since it indicates that specific tense. But here we do have sometimes a little bit of an irregularity, but only a few times. And third, the other component that each verb have are the verb endings. Here is where one of our shortcuts will come very much in handy. Now, each verb is built in the following way. We have a verb stem plus the indicator. Now, note here, for each group, second person singular, first person plural, and second person plural, and there is often a long vowel. And after the indicator, we have the verb ending. Now, while it may seem like there's just a ridiculous amount of verb forms, 20 plus 3 different groups. Now, because future 1 has 2 different conjugation patterns, depending on what conjugation a verb is. This goes for active and passive, and the imperative, which only has, obviously, singular and plural. Now, when I say groups, I'm referring to different tenses. That is just for simplicity. So, and with each of those groups, we have 6 members of that group. Again, apart from the imperative. So, there is a massive shortcut to all of these, so that you do not have to learn hundreds of verb forms. And that is based on an even closer look at the endings themselves. And once you notice this very pattern, not only will the entire conjugation become much, much easier, but you will also notice this pattern in other grammatical aspects, and not even only for Latin, but for every language with a flexion system, which means conjugation declination as well. So, the ending itself can be split into 2 further components. First, the standard. This is what the present, active and passive endings are. They do not have the second component, unless you would count it as a null component, essentially meaning the spot is not filled out. And second, a little letter or syllable exclusive to that group as well. And that's it. You will quickly notice, once you look out for it, that each ending, really the last few letters, is following the same pattern over and over again. And it is no coincidence, because those last few letters are a fixed component, indicating their own grammatical aspects. So, let us see this in action, so that you can utilize the rest of this lesson. By the way, at this point, we have reached the most fundamental part. It does not go any deeper. We are in subatomic realm now. So, let's have a look at the present tense, active and passive verb endings, because those verb endings are very important. We will have first active singular, first person, second person, third person, then plural, first, second and third, and then the same for passive. So, or, that is a long or. Now, sometimes there is a as an ending for the first person singular, which we will see in other tenses. Just note that the first person singular sometimes ends in rather than or for the active, and as we will see in a moment, r for the passive. Then we have s, t, mus, tis, and now to the passive. R, or, ris, tor, mor, mini, ntor. So, of course, you must note that goes for almost all of the verbs. Yet, as basically always, there are still a few irregularities from this rule. Now, let's have a look on a few other verb endings. For example, perfect indicative active. Here, you would actually need a different verb stem. To be more precise, the perfect stem of the verb, and then the ending attached to this. So, for example, first person singular, E, that is a long E, and that is actually one of the irregularities. The second person singular also would fall under this category. But third person singular, it, here we have E plus T. And if you remember, the present tense singular third person ending is exactly T. So, you see, the present endings are pretty important, because also in first person plural we have imus. So we have again our indicator E plus the ending from the first person plural active mus. And that's it. Now, imperfect indicative active. Here you would need the perfect stem of the verb plus the ending. In this tense, we also have a more regular indicator, bar, unlike the one in the perfect indicative active, where there is one irregularity. Here, we have the same indicator throughout the entire conjugation pattern, again with the only difference being R versus R. For example, first person singular, bum, which is bar plus M. Second person singular, bars. Here is bar with a long R plus S. Now, sometimes there is a as ending, which you will see in other forms. Just note that the first person singular sometimes ends in rather than O for active and R for passive. Yet, we are not quite done yet. There is one group of groups, so to speak, that is a bit different, and that group includes perfect indicative passive as well as conjunctive passive, then plusquamperfect indicative passive as well as plusquamperfect conjunctive passive, and future 2 indicative passive, that is to say future perfect indicative passive. You will notice that this only goes for the passive forms. Here, it is even simpler. Each verb of those groups is spelled the following way, with a participle perfect passive plus esse. And esse, which is the verb to be, is the only aspect that differentiates the different groups. You see, esse as a verb means to be, but here it works as a so-called auxiliary. By the way, esse can also be a copular verb, but it has nothing to do with our current topic of verbal conjugation. Anyway, auxiliary means that it helps to build the compound forms of those groups. And here again, the usual rule of the conjugation, as already mentioned before, does apply. So it is very, very easy. We just need to apply those rules to esse. You will need to know the different forms of esse, and that is literally the only difficult part. Because the, as I will call it, triple P, participle perfect passive, is always the same and only differs in singular versus plural. The way it works is very simple. The corresponding form of esse, for example first person singular, is immediately placed behind the triple P, for example for first person singular, depending on what tense of esse is needed for the particular group. For example, perfect indicative passive would need esse in present indicative active, which would be sum, es, est, summus, ist es, sunt, and that's it. You see, a few shortcuts here and there, and you're already good to go. And with this, our third lesson has come to an end. In our next lesson, we will look at the endings of the other tenses.